Judge Thomas Wilson had seen thousands of cases in his career. The courthouse he presided over was quiet, with few disruptions, and his reputation for being tough but fair was well established. He had no tolerance for excuses, and those who entered his courtroom knew to expect stern rulings and penalties. Today, a young black woman named Maya Williams stood before him. She had been caught speeding on a quiet back road, a simple offense, but to Judge Wilson, it was just another case to process. Maya entered the courtroom confidently, her posture straight, her eyes unwavering. There was a calmness about her, a quiet assurance that intrigued him. She spoke respectfully, acknowledging her offense but requesting leniency. "Your Honor, I understand the law, but I ask for your understanding as well. Many people, like me, face the consequences of a system that doesn't always work fairly for everyone." Judge Wilson had heard similar arguments countless times, people trying to shift blame, make excuses, or ask for special treatment. But this felt different. She wasn't making excuses. She was making a statement. He eyed her with skepticism, the faintest hint of irritation in his expression. He had a job to do, and that job was to uphold the law without bias or emotion. He had no time for political debates in his courtroom. "Ms. Williams," he began, his voice steady but firm, "the law is the law. You were speeding, and you broke it. You'll pay the fine like anyone else who commits a similar offense." He paused, looking down at the paperwork in front of him, already making his decision. No special treatment here. Maya stood there for a moment, her face betraying no emotion. Inside, though, she was frustrated. She had hoped that the judge might take a step back, listen with a more open mind. She had done everything right, showed up on time, made her case calmly, and spoke the truth. Yet here she was, just another face in the crowd of people who would be dismissed without a second thought. "I respectfully disagree," Maya said softly but firmly, not backing down. "The system isn't always just. There are deep-rooted issues that affect people like me, from the laws themselves to how they're enforced. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for fairness." Judge Wilson looked up at her with narrowed eyes, his patience thinning. He could sense the quiet intensity in her voice, but it didn't sway him. The law was the law, and as a judge, he was bound to apply it without exception. Without further comment, he handed down the fine. $150, he stated, his voice final. Court dismissed. As Maya turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of the judge's face. For a split second, she wondered if he had even heard her, but she knew this wasn't about her. Not really. This was about something much bigger. As she walked out of the courtroom, Maya didn't just leave behind a fine. She left a seed of change planted in a place she knew would one day grow. But that would take time. Maya Williams wasn't just a woman fined for a minor offense. She was a person with a deep mission that extended far beyond her court case. By day, she worked as a legal assistant at a small law firm, handling paperwork and research, often behind the scenes where she could quietly observe how the legal system worked. Her job kept her busy, but her passion for justice was never far from her mind. In fact, her evenings were spent immersed in research, reading case studies, analyzing court decisions, and connecting the dots between legal practices and the disparities she'd seen firsthand. Maya had always known that the system was flawed. Growing up, she witnessed how differently the law seemed to treat people depending on their background, race, and status. She had seen people of color receive harsher penalties, faced dismissive attitudes from police officers, and watched as the consequences of seemingly minor infractions were disproportionately handed down to those who already had fewer resources. But it wasn't until she was older, studying law on her own, that she understood just how entrenched these problems were. Each night, she pored over legal journals and articles, studying the gaps in the system. She started drafting a proposal, a blueprint for legal reform that would address the deep-seated biases within the system. Her idea was simple yet radical, a reimagining of how justice could be served. She called it a holistic approach. own that focused not just on punishment, but on rehabilitation, fairness, and equality for all. It was a vision of justice where individuals weren't just seen as their offenses, but as people who could be given opportunities to grow and reform. Maya's nights were long, but they were filled with purpose. She knew that her ideas would be controversial, that many would push back against them, but she didn't mind. This wasn't just about her. This was about creating a fairer world for future generations. The research was hard, and the setbacks were many, but she was determined. Every article, every meeting, every late night spent studying brought her closer to a larger goal, a legal system that acknowledged its flaws and worked to correct them. Beyond her work, Maya was also involved in local activist circles, where she shared her ideas and listened to the experiences of others. She spoke at events, participated in discussions, and connected with people who shared her vision. She wasn't just talking about reform. She was living it, constantly refining her thoughts and strategies, learning from those around her. Slowly, her reputation as a thought leader in the realm of legal reform began to spread. She wasn't just fighting for her own justice. Maya had a bigger picture in mind. She was determined to shake the foundations of the legal system. And every step she took, from working late into the night to meeting with other like-minded individuals, was a step toward that ultimate goal, a future where the law treated everyone fairly, regardless of their background. The fine she had been given in Judge Wilson's courtroom was just the beginning of her journey, and the spark that would eventually light a much larger fire. Maya's work began to gain traction in unexpected places. At first, her ideas seemed like whispers in a crowded room, but soon enough, those whispers became a chorus. She had begun to share her research and thoughts publicly, first through small seminars and online forums, then through larger conferences where legal professionals from all over the country gathered to discuss the future of law. She wasn't just presenting critiques. She was offering solutions grounded in data and innovative thinking that challenged traditional legal paradigms. Her breakthrough moment came when she was invited to speak at a national legal reform conference. The event, held in a grand hotel ballroom in Washington, D.C., was attended by some of the country's most respected attorneys, judges, and policymakers. Maya's heart raced as she prepared to take the stage, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her notes. She knew that this would be her chance to finally share her vision on a larger platform. She could feel the weight of the room's expectations, but she also felt an undeniable sense of purpose. When she began speaking, her voice was steady and clear, each word infused with the passion that had driven her late-night research sessions. The legal system isn't just about the laws, she told the audience. It's about who enforces them, who interprets them, and who gets affected by them. We have a system that disproportionately impacts marginalized communities, not because of the people who work within it, but because of the system itself. She outlined her vision for a more equitable system, one that recognized the power of restorative justice, the importance of reducing biases, and the necessity of empathy in legal decision-making. It wasn't just about addressing the legal framework. It was about reshaping the values at the heart of the system. Maya argued that fairness wasn't a fixed concept. It needed to be actively pursued, constantly reevaluated, and adjusted. As Maya spoke, the audience listened intently. Some nodded in agreement, while others exchanged skeptical glances. But by the end of her presentation, there was a palpable shift in the room. Her proposals were met with thoughtful questions, eager debate, and even some applause. For the first time, Maya felt like her vision could truly make a difference. Word of her talk spread quickly. Legal journals published articles highlighting her innovative ideas, and media outlets began covering her work. Maya was invited to participate in panel discussions and interviews, where she explained her ideas further. People began reaching out to her, not just activists, but also judges, lawyers, and even lawmakers, all interested in how they could incorporate some of her ideas into their own practices. The ripple effect had begun. Maya's voice, once just one among many, was now being heard in the corridors of power. She had become a symbol of the future, a future where the legal system would be held accountable to the very people it was meant to serve. And while Maya wasn't naive enough to think that the road ahead would be easy, she knew one thing. She had started something bigger than herself, and it was only getting started. Judge Thomas Wilson was used to the steady rhythm of his courtroom. He prided himself on running a tight ship, adhering to rules, and maintaining order in a way that he believed upheld the dignity of the law. His reputation for being no-nonsense was well known, and in his eyes, his decisions were based solely on the facts presented before him. Nothing more, nothing less. But lately, his routine was being disrupted in subtle ways. The legal world, he knew, seemed to be changing, and the whispers of Maya Williams were reaching his ears. It started with a colleague mentioning Maya's name during a lunch break at a judicial conference. "You heard of her?" the colleague had asked, as they discussed the latest trends in legal reform. "Maya Williams. She's pushing for a major overhaul of the system. I saw her speak last month. Some of her ideas are pretty radical, but there's something to them." At first, Wilson had dismissed it as another voice in the growing chorus of activists demanding change. But the more he heard, the more he became intrigued. Maya's name continued to pop up on the covers of legal journals, in opinion pieces, and even in discussions during seminars he attended. She wasn't just an outsider. She was getting attention from influential people within the system itself. One evening, after a particularly long day in court, Wilson sat in his office, skimming through a legal magazine. An article about Maya caught his eye. It detailed her background, her rise as a thought leader in legal reform, and her innovative ideas for tackling racial disparities in the justice system. What stood out was the section where she discussed the impact of judges' unconscious biases and the need for a more compassionate approach to sentencing. Wilson felt a twinge of discomfort. He had always prided himself on being fair, but the article made him reflect on his past decisions. Had he ever considered the broader context of the cases before him? He had always followed the law as it was written, but what if the law itself wasn't enough? The notion of bias, something he had never truly thought about in his own practices, began to settle in his mind. It gnawed at him, making him uneasy. He decided to attend one of the legal reform seminars Maya was speaking at. It wasn't easy for him to break his routine, but there was a part of him that felt drawn to it, a curiosity he couldn't ignore. When he entered the seminar room, Maya was standing at the front, speaking with a group of legal professionals. Her poise and confidence were undeniable, and as she took the stage, the room fell into rapt attention. She spoke about the power of empathy in the courtroom, about the need for judges to understand the context of the individuals they sentenced. Her words weren't just theoretical, they were rooted in real-world data, in studies that showed the effectiveness of rehabilitation over punishment. As he listened, Judge Wilson found himself questioning his own approach to justice. Had he ever really taken the time to see his defendants as people, not just case numbers? The seminar left him unsettled, yet hopeful. Maya Williams, the same woman he had found years ago, had a message he couldn't ignore. And now, as he reflected on his own experiences in the courtroom, he realized something important. Change might not be as radical as it seemed. It might be exactly what the system needed. Judge Thomas Wilson couldn't shake the thoughts that had begun to haunt him after attending Maya's seminar. He had spent years following the law to the letter, believing that his role was to apply the rules without deviation. But as he reflected on his career, he realized something profound. The law wasn't just about rules. It was about the people the rules affected. He found himself thinking about Maya's ideas constantly. Could the legal system really be reformed? Was it possible to implement her concepts in a way that didn't compromise the very structure he had sworn to uphold? Weeks passed, and Wilson found himself wrestling with these questions. He had always thought of himself as a fair judge, but what if fairness wasn't enough? He'd never truly considered the social and racial dynamics that Maya addressed. His courtroom had never seemed particularly biased. But then again, how could he be sure? What if he had missed something important? That thought weighed heavily on him. He made an unexpected decision. He reached out to Maya Williams. It wasn't easy. The very idea of reaching out to someone whose ideas he had dismissed not long ago felt awkward, even vulnerable. But there was no denying the impact she had made on his thinking, and he felt a need to understand more, both her ideas and the person behind them. The email he sent was brief, humble even. He acknowledged his past mistake in dismissing her, confessed that her work had made him rethink his approach to justice, and asked if she would be willing to meet with him to discuss her vision for legal reform. Maya received the email with surprise. She had never expected a response like this from the judge who had fined her all those years ago. At first, she hesitated. She had been outspoken about the shortcomings of the legal system and had been critical of judges like Wilson, who embodied its traditional, unyielding approach. But something told her this was different. He wasn't dismissing her anymore. He wanted to learn. They met at a quiet cafe a week later. When Maya arrived, she was unsure of what to expect. Would he be defensive? Would he only be trying to justify his past decisions? But as they began to talk, she found herself surprised by his openness. Wilson listened intently as Maya outlined her vision for a more equitable justice system. She spoke about restorative justice, the importance of understanding the whole person before making decisions, and the need for empathy in sentencing. Judge Wilson, for his part, didn't interrupt. He had no quick rebuttals or counterarguments. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions, digging deeper into her proposals. The conversation was different from any other legal discussion he had ever had. It wasn't about following the letter of the law. It was about imagining something better. By the end of their meeting, there was an unspoken understanding between them. Maya realized that Wilson wasn't just listening for the sake of politeness. He was genuinely engaged, and there was a possibility for real change. Wilson, too, left the meeting with a sense of possibility. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt that his work in the courtroom could be more than just a job. It could be a means for transformation. It was a beginning that neither of them had expected, but one that would shape the future of the justice system in ways neither could yet fully grasp. After their first meeting, Judge Wilson and Maya kept in touch. The conversations between them became more frequent, and each discussion seemed to pull Wilson further away from the rigid traditional views that had once defined his career. He began to understand the significance of what Maya had proposed, not just in theory, but in real-world practice. Her ideas weren't abstract. They were deeply practical, grounded in research, data, and personal experience. The more he learned, the more he realized how the system had been working in ways that he had never fully questioned before. Wilson began incorporating small changes in his courtroom. He started by examining his own biases more carefully. He took note of how his own assumptions might affect his rulings. He started reading about implicit bias and attended several workshops to learn how to better recognize the subconscious factors influencing his decisions. His early steps were tentative, but they were real. He began taking the time to understand the stories behind the cases before him, looking for the human element in every defendant, and considering the context of each person's life. It wasn't easy. He had spent decades in a system that emphasized efficiency over empathy, where decisions were made quickly and without much reflection. But Maya's influence was undeniable. Her belief in second chances, her focus on rehabilitation, and her unwavering faith in the potential for change struck a chord in him. He began to recognize that his job wasn't just about applying the law. It was about understanding how the law impacted people's lives and using his position to help them become better, not just punished. The next case that came before him tested this new perspective. A young man, Marcus, stood in front of him charged with a minor drug offense. Marcus had a history of addiction and had been arrested multiple times. The prosecutor pushed for a harsh sentence, pointing to Marcus's criminal record as proof that he was beyond rehabilitation. In the past, Wilson would have agreed, seeing the offense as another example of someone who had made poor choices and deserved to pay the price. But now, something felt different. Instead of immediately imposing the usual sentence, Wilson paused and looked at Marcus. He listened to the young man's story, the struggles with addiction, the difficulty of growing up in an unstable environment, and the steps he was taking to turn his life around. Wilson had heard all this before, but now he was really hearing it. He considered the broader context of Marcus's life and the systemic issues that had led him to this point. After a long moment, Wilson decided on a different course of action. He ordered Marcus to attend a rehabilitation program, coupled with community service, rather than sending him to jail. The judge also mandated follow-up counseling and regular progress check-ins. It wasn't a soft sentence. It was a sentence that offered Marcus a real chance at change. As he handed down the ruling, Wilson felt a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't just the right thing to do. It was the fair thing to do. It was a decision that took into account the person in front of him, not just the crime they had committed. For the first time in his career, he felt he had made a decision that could truly help someone. Maya's ideas had become more than just a theoretical challenge to his thinking. They had transformed how he saw his role as a judge. And for the first time, he was starting to believe that the system could be better, more compassionate, and more just. The road ahead was still long, but Wilson knew he was on the right path. Maya Williams had long known that meaningful change would never come from one individual alone. It required a collective effort, a movement that could bring together people from every corner of the legal system. And so, as she saw Judge Wilson begin to implement her ideas in his courtroom, she felt a surge of optimism. His shift in perspective wasn't just a personal victory for him. It was proof that transformation was possible, even within the very institutions that had long seemed unyielding. Wilson's decision in Marcus's case didn't go unnoticed. Word began to spread among his colleagues, and his decision was discussed at local legal conferences. Judges who had always adhered to strict sentencing guidelines began to question whether those guidelines truly served justice. Legal reform groups took notice, and Maya was invited to speak at more events, now with the added validation of Judge Wilson's public shift. The media, once skeptical of her ideas, began to cover her work more seriously, seeing that real, practical examples of reform were beginning to take shape. Maya and Wilson continued their collaboration, though it was still a delicate balance. Wilson faced resistance from some quarters. There were colleagues who believed that his new approach undermined the authority of the court, and others who worried that too much leniency might allow criminals to go unpunished. But Wilson found himself growing more confident in his decisions, emboldened by the success he saw in his own courtroom. People weren't reoffending at the rate they had before, and rehabilitation programs were showing tangible results. He wasn't just giving second chances. He was helping people take responsibility for their actions and truly change. The ripple effect of his actions grew beyond his own jurisdiction. A handful of other judges, inspired by his example, began to implement similar reforms in their own courts. Some took small steps, reducing bail for those in need of treatment, offering alternatives to incarceration for nonviolent offenders. But the shift was unmistakable. Courts across the state began experimenting with new sentencing guidelines that incorporated restorative justice principles. Maya's ideas were no longer just a theoretical proposal. They were becoming a new standard in how the justice system treated those who came through its doors. Maya, however, knew that real change needed to happen on a much larger scale. She began pushing for legislative reforms, advocating for laws that would support a more rehabilitative, restorative approach to justice. Her influence grew as she partnered with lawmakers, activists, and community leaders. Slowly but surely, bills that would reduce mandatory minimum sentences and offer more options for rehabilitation gained traction. It wasn't easy. Opposition was fierce, and the fight for reform was long and challenging. But Maya remained steadfast. She had seen firsthand that change was possible, even in the most entrenched systems. Meanwhile, Wilson's role shifted. He became more vocal about the need for systemic reform, speaking at legal conferences alongside Maya, advocating for the very changes he had once resisted. He was no longer just a judge handing down sentences. He was a part of a larger movement that sought to reshape the way America approached justice. Together, Maya and Wilson had sparked a transformation that was reverberating through the entire legal system. The path to true reform was still a work in progress, but with every step, the world was becoming a little more just. Their partnership, once unlikely, had proven that change was possible, not just in the system, but in the people who worked within it. Years passed, and the changes Maya Williams and Judge Thomas Wilson had initiated began to reshape the legal landscape in ways that were once thought impossible. What had started as a quiet conversation between a young activist and a seasoned judge had blossomed into a nationwide movement for justice reform, one that reached far beyond the confines of courtrooms and legal institutions. Maya stood before a packed auditorium at a national conference on criminal justice reform, receiving an award for her groundbreaking contributions. The room was filled with lawmakers, advocates, and legal professionals, all of whom had played a part in the sweeping changes that had begun with her work. On stage, beside her, stood Judge Wilson, once the symbol of the traditional, no-nonsense legal system. Now he was an outspoken advocate for reform, a tireless supporter of the compassionate, rehabilitative approach to justice that had become a model for others to follow. As Maya took the stage to accept her award, the applause was thunderous. She paused, looking out over the sea of faces that had come to recognize her vision for what it was, not just a critique of the system, but a blueprint for a better one. She knew this moment wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had fought alongside her, everyone who had believed that change was possible. The law, once a tool of division and punishment, was now seen as a force for healing and restoration. When she spoke, her voice was steady and full of gratitude. "I stand here today, not as someone who set out to tear down a broken system," she said, "but as someone who believed that it could be rebuilt. And thanks to the dedication of so many of you in this room, we've proven that change is not just a dream. It's a reality." Judge Wilson, standing beside her, added, "The law isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about understanding the full context of each person's story and providing opportunities for growth, rehabilitation, and redemption. We've come a long way, but we have a lot more work to do." Together, they reflected on the long road that had brought them to this point. From the fateful day when Maya stood before Wilson in his courtroom, fined for a traffic violation, to the partnership that had transformed not only their lives, but the entire legal system. The movement they had sparked was now a force to be reckoned with, one that had garnered support from across the political spectrum and in communities nationwide. The policies they had championed, rehabilitative sentencing, restorative justice practices, alternatives to incarceration, and more equitable treatment for marginalized communities, were now a standard part of legal practice in states across the country. In many places, restorative justice circles had replaced traditional punitive measures, and more funding was directed toward education, mental health, and substance abuse programs rather than overcrowded jails. Maya looked around the room, her heart swelling with pride. This was just the beginning. The journey they had started was already transforming lives. The legal system, once a symbol of injustice for so many, was becoming a vehicle for real change. And Maya knew that as long as people like her and Judge Wilson were willing to stand up and fight for what was right, the future of justice would continue to evolve. Fairer, more compassionate, and ultimately, more just.